Last week, I stopped us short, so we're going to backtrack a small amount this morning, and then finish last week's, and then I added some more onto it over the week. And if you remember, we were talking about rhetoric as part of different ways that we can read scriptures. So we're looking at 7 ways to read scriptures over the past several weeks. And this last one we're talking about is rhetoric. And that rhetoric is a form of communication that we use today that you can read in books. I was thinking this morning, if you open up any kind of, we'll say, crime novel, Lisa and I love watching the UK crime dramas, and I was thinking about it, and every form of language that we've been talking about and of ways that you can read scripture are displayed in the stories, right? Obviously, there's accusers and victims, and there's law, but then there's crazy characters and narrators. There's definitely rhetoric. It seems like the detectives and the police officers like using analogies and rhetoric to try to capture the thief into telling them, or the murderer to telling them exactly what they did to get them to admit what they've done. And that is exactly what we saw last week that Jesus was doing. And we had gone into Jesus in Matthew, going through, taking them through not excluding one of the children, because if you exclude the child, it's just like if you were excluding somebody from the kingdom, which people, as Pharisees especially, were doing. And so Jesus was trying to get that across to them. And he used a parable, he used a few parables. And if you go across the Gospels, there's different parables mixed into that, and they all point to one thing. And so Jesus was using a form of rhetoric, which is the parable, to get the people to understand what he was trying to say, something that they would have connected with. And we know that, we've talked about literalists. A true literalist, would have a difficult time understanding the parables because they're looking for a straightforward, just say it like it is, right? We do that. We like to have things straightforward as it is. Yet when someone uses a rhetorical process to get something across to us, normally it kind of registers. It might take a few minutes sometimes if you're like me and you're a little slow and somebody's telling you something and you walk away. And after they walk away, 5 minutes later, you're like, oh, I get what they're saying now. And you want to go back to them and say something, but then you feel stupid, so you don't. But you know what they're trying to say. And the disciples even would ask Jesus after the parable, what are you trying to say? So you can almost hear the disciples saying, just give it to us, right? Give it to us. And of course, Jesus said that he used the parables or the rhetoric to others for different reasons. But if you want to turn to Matthew chapter 18, that's where we're going to pick up. And I know that we already read Matthew chapter 18 last week, but we're going to read it again. So Jesus is trying to appeal to a fact, and the fact is that the Heavenly Father is going to make sure that every last one is found. None are going to be lost. He's going to find them all. And Jesus uses rhetoric to drive that point home. Let's have a word of prayer before we read this. Lord, we're thankful that we can gather together. We're thankful for the Bible, Lord, that we can have an awesome record of your relationship with men. Lord, very thankful that as we learn things and we see that you communicated in the Bible through the Bible, just as people communicated with each other. And Lord, we're thankful that you would bring yourself down to a level that was on par with humanity, so that we could get an understanding of who you are. And of course, Lord, you sent your Son to really get down on our level, and he communicated with others in the same way they communicated with themselves, with each other, so that we could also today have an even deeper understanding. Lord, we're thankful for that. We're thankful for those that are here today, thankful for those that are listening. Lord, we hope that as we've learned all these things, that they can be at least somewhat applied to the scriptures as we read them, and help us get a greater understanding of what's trying to be said, and ultimately that we would let these things work in us, in our hearts and our minds, so they would influence the way that we live and the way that we're portrayed in the world, so that we may manifest you. Amen. All right, so we're going to go to Matthew chapter 18, and we're going to read verses 10 to 14. See that you do not despise one of these little ones. For I say to you that their angels in heaven continually see the face of my Father who is in heaven. For the Son of Man has come to save that which was lost. What do you think? If any man has 100 sheep, and one of them has gone astray, does he not leave the 99 on the mountains and go and search for the one that is straying? If it turns out that he finds it, truly I say to you, he rejoices over it more than over the 99 which have not gone astray. So it is not the will of your Father who is in heaven that one of these little ones should perish. So Jesus is again trying to get the point home to them that God does not leave any behind. So neither should you. And how does he do it? In the form of a question. He asked a question. What would you do if this was the situation you were confronted with? And then he brings something out to them. We did something a long time ago about the Pharisees. And some of the people he's talking to, though they owned sheep, they had shepherds in their employment. And so they wouldn't necessarily go out and do this. But they still understood what he was trying to say. They don't want any of their sheep lost because they are a form of income for them, right? They get sheared, their wool is used, and whatever else they might use sheep for. Milk. I don't know if they made sheep's milk cheese back then, or if they made cheeses, but I'm sure they made something like that. And so the sheep would have been very important to them. Every single one is going to be found. He also says, which I thought was interesting, I don't know if you've ever done this, but if you take this parable and you take it, I guess it's, we call it a parable, but it's really, I think it's still kind of straightforward, right? Because it's something they know about. If you lost this, you would go find it. You wouldn't just, it's not something that I don't think they had to think too far about, hopefully. But if you take this and you pair it with the prodigal son, the parable of the lost son, right? The son that was at home was always at home. He was always working for his dad. He was always taking care of the business. He was there. They enjoyed meals together. They had fellowship together. They were together. When the lost one was found, there was rejoicing and there was a party and they had a good time. And the one that was always there was kind of put off by that because there wasn't a party. But like it says here, you rejoice over it more than the other 99. And so it's that idea that those who are already in there, in the kingdom, and enjoying it every day and understanding it, are there. They have the relationship. This is about the ones that don't. And in the context, it's about, if you go up to the beginning of chapter 18, it's about those that are already in it or enjoying it, not keeping others out. And so that would be like the father telling the son who was at home, why are you getting upset? Your brother has been found. He's home. It's almost like the son who stayed would have rather that the other son, his brother, never came home. He just stayed away, right? And he had this feeling over him that, oh, he's back and look what he gets. And so this is the purpose of rhetoric that Jesus is using. He's making an appeal to an emotional appeal to a situation that could be emotional to others, and letting them understand and come up with the reasoning themselves rather than just coming out and saying it. Don't we learn better when we figure something out ourselves? Some people, right? I know there's different learning styles, but many of us, we can hear something and we get it. And then 2 months later, we go out and we're like, ooh. So we have to go back, right? And consult the source again. Maybe watch somebody do it. You know, nowadays you have YouTube videos for anything, right? Bless you. At work, we have anywhere. We have the hand staplers, not for stapling paper, but for stapling stuff together. And there's no button on there that opens it up if it gets stuck. You have to use something to try to get the staple out of there. And I went on YouTube because someone had put small paper staples into it and it was all jammed up and I couldn't get them out. And I couldn't find any way to open it up. So I went on YouTube and watched, and the guy on YouTube says he goes to Goodwill and other places and just buys these all the time because people just get rid of them because they can't fix them. So they're always buying new ones. And he has a video on how you take it apart, which is pretty cool. So I took one apart. Now, I wouldn't be able to do that again unless I watched the video again. I'd have to do it numerous times on my own before I fully could say, hey, this is how you take these apart. And that's exactly what Jesus is doing here. He's trying to get them to think of something that they go through constantly on their own, that they can have a better understanding of it. So Jesus talks about this again in Luke chapter 15. We said last week that Jesus was a master of rhetoric. And he certainly was. I mean, not understanding that before I looked at all this or learned all this, it just, adds another layer of understanding to you when Jesus is speaking and now knowing, well, this is what he's doing. We're going to read verses 1 through 7. It says, now all the tax collectors and all the sinners were coming near to him to listen. Both the Pharisees and the scribes began to grumble, saying, this man receives sinners and eats with them. So he told them this parable, saying, what man among you, if he has 100 sheep and has lost one of them, does not leave the 99 in the open pasture and go after the one which was lost until he finds it? When he has found it, he lays it on his shoulders, rejoicing. And when he comes home, he calls together his friends and his neighbors, saying to them, rejoice with me, for I have found my sheep which was lost. I tell you that in the same way, there will be more joy in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 righteous persons who need no repentance. Now, if you continue reading, you go through and you even get finally to the Prodigal Son. So it's a series of parables, just like in Matthew, that are pointing to the same thing. Here, he's talking, and it's sinners and tax collectors, the dregs of society that Jesus is about to have dinner with. And the Pharisees are there, and they're grumbling because he's bringing in all these people. And these people are people they would rather not be around, that they think belong way off here. They're really righteous. These people are sinners. Thank God I'm not like one of them. We remember that one. And that is what the same point that Jesus was bringing in Matthew 18. They would just as soon not have these people around, not have these people partake of their little group, than to have them be found. And so Jesus, again, goes through the parable of the 99, of the one that's lost, to bring about the idea, which he brings in even closer in Luke, which is in heaven, where the Father is, there is more joy over every single one that is found. He says over 99 righteous persons. And I hope we know that when he says 99 righteous people, it's kind of sarcastic, right? Because the Pharisees aren't righteous. They think they're righteous, but really they're lost just as the other ones are. And so God is looking for them as much as he is for the sinners and the tax collectors, as the Pharisees like to call them. They're all lost, and he's there for them all. We know elsewhere in the Gospels, he tells the Pharisees what they're like and that they're not righteous. But they think they are. And so Jesus goes through all this, and he's going through all this in these multiple parables and questionings, because he's trying to get them to understand that God does not lose anything, nothing. All will be found by God. Let's turn, go ahead and go back to chapter 14, and we're going to read from there in a moment. But I want to read this quote one more time. I read it last week. I don't know if you all remember what the quote is about, or the general gist of it. Let me find it here. And this is, again, Brad Jerzak, what he has from his book that we've been looking at. He says, I would argue that the number one genre error in biblical interpretation occurs when we mistake epistles for straightforward didactic teaching when, in fact, they are rhetorical sermons designed to be preached aloud in the congregation. By misreading them as instruction manuals, we can miss the tone of the letters, read verses in isolation, and lose the larger point. And so that's what we do all the time. I do it. I'm sure you all do it. We read things and we miss what's really being said or what the larger point is, because we get focused in on one thing. And we end up taking, some people will say, some people believe that the Bible, and you hear them say things like this, the Bible's an instruction manual. Everything you need to know about life is in the Bible. Yet you go out into the world and something happens and you come home and you try to find it in the Bible, or you try to think of, when did this happen in the Bible? Well, obviously there are situations that people went through in the Bible. The Bible is more about the relationship of men and God trying to reach man than it is an instruction manual. We've talked before about how the books of wisdom, like Proverbs, aren't all factual. They have things in them that would be like, man, it sure would be great if this was actually true all the time. Sometimes it's true. Other times it's not true. And so, it's not an instruction manual. It's something that we can read so we can have a better relationship with God, which in turn is going to improve our relationship with people. I think that's closer to the idea of what the scriptures are about, which of course goes to the greatest parable, or the greatest commandment, right? Love God with all your heart, your soul, your mind, with all you are, and love your neighbor as yourself. That's what the driving point, I think, is in all of its seemingly complexities brought down to the simplest form of what God is trying to get across to us. So when he talks about a tone in the passage, an emotional tone. There's opposites, paired opposites. So how do you get emotion across? If you're reading a novel and there's a part of the novel and it's just wonderful, makes you feel warm inside, this is great. And then, I'm trying to think of an example. So Lisa loves Hallmark movies. And I watch Hallmark movies. I don't watch them. I'll sit in the room and play on my phone. And, sometimes she jokes that the only reason I'm sitting in there is so I can make fun of the movie. Because that's what I do, right? Because some of them seem a little hokey. But at the same time, they are somewhat of an emotional drain. Because everything is great. All stories are all the same. Two people meet each other and fall in love. Everything is going great. And all of a sudden, something happens and the relationship falls apart. And then slowly, it all comes together in the end and everybody's happy, right? It's just told in different ways. And that's not rhetoric, but it's the contrasting of emotions, right? Happy, sad, then happy. The scriptures do the same thing. We have anger and then calm, fear and confidence, rebuke or pity, envy or emulation. And so those things go through the scriptures. You read something and it fills you with joy and happiness and confidence in who you are. And if you keep reading the next chapter, all of a sudden, wait a minute. Now it's telling me I'm this. Now my confidence might wane a little bit. It's kind of like putting you into your place, right? Remember, you are this, but you're also here and you're this. It causes you to think, all right, so I have to, not that I have to do something. It's not a call for works, but it's a call, I think of it now as a call for action, right? Action on my part to know what I am in God's eyes and how I can live that way, to meet up to that, to what I am. So I had you go to Luke 14, I believe. And we're going to read verses 21. So before I get started, we're in the parable in my Bible, Parable of the Dinner is the heading, which starts in chapter 16. And the man's given a big banquet. He tells his servants, go out and invite people to come to the banquet. He invited many people. So he's going to tell them, go find the people I invited. Why aren't they here? Tell them, come on, let's go. And of course, they all have different reasons why they can't come. And we pick it up in verse 21. It says, and the slave came back and reported to his master. Then the head of the household became angry and said to his slave, go out at once into the streets and the lanes of the city and bring in here the poor and the crippled and the blind and lame. And the slave said, Master, what you commanded has been done, and still there is more room. And the master said to the slave, go out into the highways and along the hedges and compel them to come in so that my house may be filled. For I tell you, none of those men who were invited shall taste of my dinner. So if we read the whole story together, we have a range of emotions. We have a man who was throwing a dinner. There was elation. There was, they were excited. There was a happiness, a lot of planning, a lot of stuff that went into it. Food making. You know, when you're making food for a dinner, sometimes it's more stress, right? Because you're like, oh, I got to get all this done before they come. But if we were to plan things out and do things the way we would do without giving ourselves stress, there might be happiness. In some cultures, before they have a big dinner and they're making food and preparing food and going out to the market and getting different things to the fields and picking and preparing it, they love it. And they gather around in the kitchen making stuff, and the emotion there is joy because they're going to share food and sit around with food together. And then he's invited all these people. And all the people that he's invited, I'm sure, are people that he knows. He can't wait to get them all together. And then he finds out they're not coming. And so it says he was angry. He's upset. How could they not want to come? And so he sends out his servant. And when his servant goes out and comes back, and he has all the reasons why they can't come, and he sends them out again, and he finds other people that he can invite. And you think here about people, he says right here, they're crippled and poor and blind and lame, people that normally wouldn't get to come to something like this. Let's go bring them in. Bring them into this supper, to this party we're going to have. And you think there's joy again. Because the people I want to come won't come, but I have all this wonderful food that we've prepared. And so let's get people in together and let's go ask people who might not be able to come so we could share with them too. And when the slave come back and says there's still more room, I imagine that this man, the master, has even more excitement and joy because now he says, all right, we still have a lot of room. Go even further out and get even more people to come in. And so they all come. And he says in the end that none of the men who were invited shall taste of my dinner. I wonder what he was feeling then. What would you feel? Spiteful? Right? Hungry. By that time, right? The food's getting cold, Carl says. Let's eat. I don't think he was spiteful. I think he was just being matter-of-factly. They don't want to come. I have all these other people to share with, and that's great. So there's a range of emotions, and through that range of emotions, something is being told, something they're supposed to grab out of it. And in this point, they're supposed to grab out of it when God calls, when God says, come into my kingdom. Not only do you want to be someone who does not allow someone else to come in, but you don't want to be a person who shuns him and says, no, I don't want to come, because you are going to miss something wonderful. And all the people that you imagine in your mind who could never possibly be invited by God to a dinner are going to be at that dinner while you're not. And so these are the types of things that Jesus uses as he goes through. And in Matthew chapter 7, we're not going to turn to verse 28. Think about the end of the Sermon on the Mount. It says, and the crowds were amazed. Right? They were amazed because he spoke elsewhere. How did he speak? As one who had authority, as one who knew what he was talking about, as one that they could actually listen to and get what he was trying to say. And through the Sermon on the Mount, it's the same thing. There's ups and there's downs. There's joy and there's shame. It's all over the place. But when he's done with it, they all leave with an understanding of, wow, that was amazing. That was incredible. And so they knew exactly what he was saying, and he used rhetoric to get it all across. And so the next section that we would look at in our book review would be rhetorical criticism. And what is criticism? Years ago, when I first read of, a critic, I would always think of movie critics, right? And they tell you everything that's wrong with the movies. And that's what always stuck in my head. What was wrong with all these movies? I can't remember their names. Driscoll and Ebert, thank you. One loves the movie. thumbs up. And the other hates the movie, thumbs down. One guy's giving you all the great things and why this movie is great and you should go see it. And the other one is like, no, don't waste your time. Sometimes they both said, no, it's not worth your time. And other people would come out and say, oh, if they say it's bad, then it's got to be good. And so we would all go watch it, and the movie makers would make tons of money. That's what I used to think of criticism. But we talk about criticism of language or textual criticism. It's about reading it and dissecting it and trying to figure out what is being said or what are the tools being used to get across what's being said. So rhetorical criticism then would be reading something that's rhetorical and breaking it down and trying to see what exactly is being said. It's an important option when we interpret the New Testament. So we said before, Jesus was a master in rhetoric. His parables and sermons show that. They're highly rhetorical, not to be taken in absolute literalism. They're a literal sense. So he's trying to get something across. This is something that might really happen, but it's not about a real situation necessarily. Trying to get his audience to think. According to Brad, some of the literary devices that we've been looking at, so we think of victims, accusers in law, rhetoric, remember text and travail, crazy characters and narrators, and upcoming, we'll look at diatribe. All of these things, he said, permeate 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, Hebrews, and 1st and 2nd Peter. And I think certainly most of Paul's letters. And Jesus. So really, he brings these books out, but I think we can find these in all of the New Testament. It's important. So it's a wide range of different forms of communication that's being used to drive home some points. And so today what we're going to do is we're going to go to Hebrews, and we'll start in chapter 4. So I don't know if you remember when we were doing text and travail, and we talked about the prophets and how if you read Isaiah or Jeremiah, especially those two, or the minor prophets, you go through these highs and lows all the time. It's up and down, right? It's a prophecy about the kingdom that's coming and the salvation of Israel, and it's great. And then the next chapter is the destruction of Jerusalem and, all the things that God is going to do to the nations and all of this, and it's down. And you go a couple chapters later and it's back up again. So there's these ups and these downs, but the ending is up. And it's trying to bring us to a certain understanding of how things are going and happening in the world. In Hebrews is the same. And I guess I've never looked at Hebrews like that before. But the more I thought about it, the more I thought, not just in Hebrews, but like I just said, in Paul's letters, it's the same thing. And of course, many think, and we think that Paul wrote Hebrews, but even if you read Ephesians or Philippians or Colossians or any of those, you get these moments of, wow, this is who I am. And then later in the book of Ephesians, he's talking about children obeying parents and what's going to happen if you don't, and how you need to obey and how you need to love, and you do all these things, and what happens to people who don't. Or who don't do these things, and how beware if you're not doing this. So he starts up here and then he kind of droops off and then ends it on a high again. So the Hebrews is the same way. And there's a point to it, and it's rhetoric. So in Hebrews 4, in verses 14 to 16, we read, therefore, Since we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold fast our confession. For if we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who has been tempted in all things as we are, yet without sin. Therefore, let us draw near with confidence to the throne of grace, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need. And this whole chapter, the heading of my chapter is the believer's rest. This whole chapter is leading up to a point here that we can have confidence in Jesus. Because while we're weak in the world and weak to things around us, we know that we have confidence approaching God regardless, because Jesus is our priest. And Jesus went through these same things. Jesus was tempted just like we are. Jesus lived in the world and had many things happen to him. He encountered many situations, and yet he succeeded. And he is the one that we go through to get to God. And so that's who God sees in us. And so we have confidence, and that brings us joy. It makes us feel sure at times in our life as we're walking through life that, yes, Jesus is my priest. He went through it all. I can do it also through him. God sees me as this. I can go to God with anything, and God is not going to think lesser of me because of Jesus. I mean, that's like a really high point, right? And if you keep reading in the next chapters about the perfect high priest, and it kind of continues. And if we go down to verse 11 of chapter 5, we read, concerning him, we have much to say, and it is hard to explain, since you have become dull of hearing. For though by this time you ought to be teachers, you have need again for someone to teach you the elementary principles of the oracles of God. And you have come to need milk and not solid food. For everyone who partakes only of milk is not accustomed to the word of righteousness, for he is an infant. But solid food is for the mature, who because of practice have their senses trained to discern good and evil. So in chapter 4, they have confidence. No matter what they're going through, no matter what they've done, they have confidence in Jesus because Jesus has gone through it and he has overcome it. And through him, they can talk to God. They can approach God. They can approach his throne. And then in the next chapter, what does he tell them? None of you are listening. You're dull. And in your dullness, you can't even portray what you're supposed to be to others. You can't, right now, you should be at the point where you're teaching people. Where I read that more of as you should be an example. In everything in your life, people should be looking to you and saying, that guy knows Jesus. That guy understands what God is doing. Instead, he's telling them, you should be ashamed. Right? That's basically what he's saying. So they went from confidence, which brings, when I'm confident about something, it's a feeling of happiness. I'm going about doing something that I've done many, many times, like say at work. I've done it so many times. I could do it with my hands tied behind my back. I am so confident this is nothing. I got it. And so when someone asks you to do something, you think, wow, I can do this. And I'm not only going to make myself happy, but I'm going to make their lives easier and I'm going to make them happy because they're going to understand or they're going to see that I know what I'm doing. And they're going to learn something from me. And they're going to want to do the same thing I'm doing. And maybe that'll help them elevate in their life somehow. It's like, you're way up here. And then Paul comes in the next chapter and he knocks them way down and says, but you're missing something. And because you're missing something, others are missing something. I think that's what he talks about in chapter 14. Solid food is for the mature, who because of practice, I think that's a really important phrase, who because of practice, because they live it. It's their daily practice just in their lives. They have learned to discern good and evil, and they practice it. And therefore, they are like what he talked about in verse 12, a teacher to others. So they've become dull of hearing. They're not good teachers. They're not who they should be. So they need little things to get them to that point. But there's some people that you can look up to in chapter 14. And I think the people in chapter 14 are probably the people in chapter 4 who are the confident ones, because they know. And so there's two contrasts of emotions. In chapter 10, in verse 26, Paul says, "For if we go on sinning willfully after receiving the knowledge of the truth, there no longer remains a sacrifice for sins, but a terrifying expectation of judgment and the fury of fire which will consume the adversaries. Anyone who has set aside the law of Moses dies without mercy on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. How much severer punishment do you think he will deserve who has trampled underfoot the Son of God, who has regarded as unclean the blood of the covenant by which he was sanctified, and has insulted the Spirit of grace? For we know him who said, 'Vengeance is mine, I will repay.' And again, the Lord will judge his people. It is a terrifying thing to fall into the hands of the living God." Wow. Have you ever read this and thought, wait a minute, how does this square up with everything Paul taught in Romans about grace? You ever wondered that? What's going on here, right? Paul is using rhetoric. He's bringing them up, and he's bringing them down, and he's going to bring them up, and he's trying to get them to think simply about how are you living? Because it's very important for the believer to live a certain way. It's not only important in their relationship with God, but it's important in their relationship with the world. How are you living? And so Paul says here, now that it's terrifying. Is it terrifying? What do we understand about grace? When I stand before God, should it be terrifying? It shouldn't be terrifying, right? No. But when you think about it, if you really had to stand there right now, if you thought to yourself and you're sitting there, God suddenly was going to appear in the middle of this room, would you be terrified? Honestly, you might be. What did I do last night? What did I do last week? The last person I talked to, I dressed up and down with every curse word under the book because they did something wrong instead of having grace. And what does the Bible say? If you don't have mercy, you won't get mercy, right? You read all these things and you compare them to what we know about grace. I think that maybe these are more about what we feel and how the emotions we have when we think, I'm going to stand before God someday. Because we're all going to be judged, right? Scripture says it. Even believers will be judged. We are going to be judged. We're not going to be judged for sins because that's been taken care of. But we are going to be judged for how we live and manifest and spread the news of the kingdom and spread the grace of God to other people. And we can't do that if we're doing all the things that he's talking about here. And so it's like a fury of fire. Paul says in Corinthians that everyone is judged. Everyone goes through the fire, and you will be saved as though it was through fire, because you will be judged. And he says that all of the dross, all of the wood, hay, and stubble will all be burned off. It'll all be made nothing. And what will be left will be the purified metals. And that is what I believe, and I think what we believe in general, that That's Jesus in us. How we have worked to that point in our lives to magnify him, that's what is left. And it says that you will suffer loss. And so that is a terrifying thing to think about. And so the range of emotions now has really dropped. We read more in chapter 10. We're going to read 32 to 39. But remember the former days when, after being enlightened, you endured a great conflict of sufferings, partly being made a public spectacle through reproaches and tribulations, and partly by becoming sharers with those who were so treated. For you showed sympathy to the prisoners and accepted joyfully the seizure of your property, knowing that you have for yourselves a better possession and a lasting one. Therefore, do not throw away your confidence, which has a great reward. For you have need of endurance, so that when you have done the will of God, you may receive what is promised. For yet in a very little while, he who is coming will come and will not delay. But my righteous one shall live by faith. And if he shrinks back, my soul has no pleasure in him. But we are not of those who shrink back to destruction, but of those who have faith to the preserving of the soul. So we're going back up again, right? The emotions are going back up. We still have a little bit of negativity in here of people who are not doing, not practicing, and shrinking back from the faith that they're supposed to be living. And others who Paul says, you are these who aren't shrinking back. So you are going to be the ones who are going to live, and he has pleasure in when he comes. And so it's coming. Starting to bring the folks back up here. And the last part is Hebrews 11:39, 12 to 3. I shouldn't say the last part. You got to read all of Hebrews together. Remember, we said that these were letters read with emotion. Somebody got this scroll. It went to various places, copies of it, and they read it, and they practiced reading it, and they practiced what kind of commentary, what they were going to say about the things he's saying based on things they've experienced through him or with him. They read these things. And then when they got up and they read it before the audience or the crowd or the other believers from their group, they read it with emotion because they understood that there was emotion in it. And so it has to be read straight through. We're just pulling out a couple parts to show emotion, not any type of theology or anything. So understand that. We're going through the roller coaster. He says in all these things, and he's in verse 39 of chapter 11, talking about those who had faith. And all these, having gained approval through their faith, did not receive what was promised, because God had provided something better for us, so that apart from us, they would not be made perfect. Therefore, since we have so great a cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let us also lay aside every encumbrance and the sin which so easily entangles us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. For consider him who has endured such hostility by sinners against himself, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. So in everything that Paul just read in these few passages we read, they have confidence in Jesus for exactly what he just said right here, because he lived it, he endured, and so you can. Then through, you should be shameful, because though you know this, you're not practicing it. You're not living it. People aren't seeing it. And then he starts to bring them up, and to this point, you have it. Practice it. Keep your eyes on Jesus because of what he did. You can do it. Get through it. He endured hostilities. Remember in the passage you just read a moment ago, we read about their things that they went through. Loss of possessions, being made public spectacles in front of people because of what they believed. They were going through it. Keep your eyes fixed on the prize, which is Jesus, and stay on it, because you will be, in the end, rewarded with what is happening, with what God is doing. And so these passages then, as we go up and down, don't become empty, as some people say, empty rhetoric. Because even though there's the up and down and you think, well, I don't understand why he says that when we already know what he taught about grace. Because he's trying to get your mind to go through this range of emotions so that you start thinking every day, every moment, as I'm living. Remember who I am and how I'm supposed to live. Remember Jesus. Remember that he went through it. Remember how he got through things, which was keeping his faith in his Father, and that we can do the same. We won't always, as Paul said here in Hebrews, we're not always going to emulate that. There are going to be times when we're going to say, shameful because of what I just did or how I didn't live it. But remember, there's that high, there's that confidence. You get back up to that point by doing what he said, those who practice living in. And so he uses rhetoric, not to be taken necessarily absolutely literal. That if God was before me, there's going to be a fury of fire because of what I just did, because I know that that's not the case, right? Of course, there's some element of fear of God standing before me, because now I'm like I am right now. But hopefully someday I'll understand enough and have practiced enough and lived enough to know that when I stand before him, even though I know I did things I wasn't supposed to, or I didn't live the way I should, what he's doing is for love. And it's a loving judgment, the burning off of these things. And so it's not empty. So we should never take it as in, well, he's saying this here, but elsewhere he says something different. It's contrasting. That's rhetoric. That's what rhetoric is. And it's all throughout the New Testament. I have one other quote to read. I have page 241, and it says, we are expected to recognize the rhetoric. Since they do, we are expected. So since these hearers, the people who were sitting down and listening to Hebrews being read to them, they knew the uses, because in their day, remember we said it was very common. People went to school to learn about rhetoric. The Greeks were very fluent in it. And so were the Jewish men and the Romans. It was commonly used. Since they do, we are expected to recognize the rhetoric just as we are meant to recognize poetry, parables, or symbolic visions, and understand the flattery, threats, or pathos at some level as non-literal, while not dismissing their important meaning as empty. We need to read behind and beneath the rhetoric to identify the author's intent and God's message. Rather than interpreting their rhetoric woodenly or over literally, isolating or totalizing a single paragraph, we need to learn how to read through the rhetorical text so as not to throw them into direct conflict with the gospel teachings of Christ and his apostles on mercy, grace, and forgiveness, and especially the way of the cross, which God incarnate not only taught but lived as a preeminent revelation of the nonviolent God. How easy would it be to pick out that part of Hebrews, which you just read, that talked about fury and fire and shame, and clobbered it over the head of somebody. But knowing full well in our minds that, hey, there's also a lot about this other stuff. And so how does it tie together? That is what rhetoric is. And next, we're going to look at diatribe, hopefully next week. And so we'll see you here in about 5 or 10 minutes.